affect different parts of your soul. And this is why the prohibitions of music are there, because music is very, very dangerous. And a lot of people don't know what they're doing with the music. And if you don't believe this, all you have to do is look at some documentary footage of what was called Beatlemania in the West, and how mad people went over new sounds of music that were being popularized and promoted over the airways. And rock and roll had a massive impact on people. And as it got darker and darker, and you went into these heavy metal and all these other types of, you get some really, really serious problems at these concerts where people literally will go mad. I mean, obviously there's drug involvement, and this is another reason, because you'll find many of the hadith that talk about the prohibition of music also have drugs mentioned in the same hadith. In fact, there's an argument that all of them have drugs mentioned in the same hadith. And the Prophet ﷺ said the end of time won't come until people permit. And then he said, music, basically the sex, because that's the word he used meant that. And then drugs, intoxicants. So he actually mentioned those three together, right? Which in Western parlance is sex, drugs, and rock and roll, which became a kind of mantra of the 1960s. And we're still feeling the repercussions of that in the West since that time, which was a massive change. And Plato argued that you will never change musical modes in a society except that it will have a radical effect on the culture and nature of the society. So musical changes actually are harbingers of shifts within society. And so this is called ethos theory in the Greek tradition, that music has a powerful impact on the soul. Rumi in the Masnawi, rahimahullah, talks about the soul being really almost seduced into the body with the flute, the reed flute. And that's an indication, a mythological indication of the power that music has. And he talks about the morose sounds of the reed flute and the impact that they have on the heart. So music is very powerful, and it's really not something to be played with, because people don't know what they're doing. And in traditional, like if you go into traditional like ragas in Indian music, they have a whole science, and they know that they're having an impact on people. Al-Farabi wrote a book called Kitab al-Musiq al-Kabir, and in that book he gives you the maqamat to use that where you can make people laugh. If you play the maqams, they'll start laughing uncontrollably. You can play other maqams and they'll start crying. And so this is the power that exists in this form. So what you have to understand is that the religion does not have a blanket permissibility, and it doesn't have a blanket prohibition, but it has a dialectic of tension to make sure that we don't go astray in either way. And so, for instance, what we just heard, which is sama', you can, if you're present, if your heart's open to it, it can actually have a very powerful spiritual impact on you. I mean, they can put you into a state of hudur, of presence with your Lord. And this can happen. And obviously, the Quran does this as well for people. And I don't want to put them in the same category, because they're not. إِذَا جَاءَ الْحَقِّ زَهِقَ الْبَاطِلِ. Everything other than the Quran, in terms of this, has a vacuity to it. But the meanings also are embodied in these words. The things that they're saying, are very powerful things. Imam al-Busayri, they were just reciting very powerful meanings from Imam al-Busayri. So just to look at a few things, he says that the Imam Muhammad al-Hassan says, quoting Mafatih al-Kunuz, that sama' has three categories. The first is absolute prohibition, and this is for the majority of people. And this is the traditional view. I'm just giving you what the ulama have said. And these are for young people that become very affected by it, and the shahawat are ghaliba alayhim. When they have too much of their licentious nature is too strong. So the shahawat, the concupiscent soul, is very strong, and they haven't learned to control that yet. That this can actually arouse in them passions. And so for these people, it's not a good thing. And also because they haven't purified their hearts and worked on that. And so the sama' can actually have a negative effect on those people. And then the second one is mubah. And this is people that can listen to it and they just enjoy the sounds of it. And so it doesn't have a negative impact on them, but it's something that they take pleasure in. وَيَتَرَوَّحْ. They get some repose or something. And the third one is mandub, and these are the people that love Allah, and it actually encourages them to get closer to Allah, that they feel a nearness from it, and so it affects them in that way. And Sidi Ahmed Zarruq in his commentary on the Baghrisiya, and this is very interesting lafta of Sidi Ahmed Zarruq, a indication that he got out of it. He said, Amma adatul lahwi, this is in his commentary. The Baghrisiya is a famous primer that was used by the Malikis in North Africa. He was a great Algerian scholar, Abdurrahman al-Waghlisi, and his book was used for many hundreds of years as a primer, like Ibn Ashir. Ibn Ashir pretty much became the dominant text. But before that, Al-Waghrisi and the Qurtubiyya were more dominant. Anyway, it's a beautiful text, and Sidi Ahmad Zarruq did a very nice commentary on it. But he says, وَأَمَّا آلَةُ اللَّهْوِ كَالْبُوقِ وَالْغِيطَ وَالْعُودِ وَغَيْرِهَا مِنْ آلَةِ الطَّرَبِ فَلَا يُحِلُّ سَمَعُهَا اخْتِيارًا. So, Sidi Ahmad Zarruq says, as for these instruments of diversion, lahu is diversion, anything that entertains you, diverts you. He says, like the buq, the drum, the ghita, it's like a bagpipe, and then the oud, which is a stringed instrument, and these other types of instruments that are alat al-tarab. They're means by which people are excited. فَلَا يَحِلُّ سَمَعُهَا اخْتِيارًا. It's not permissible to listen to them by choice. So if you're hearing it in a store, doesn't go under that category. But then he says, وَمَا يُذْكَرُ عَنْ إِبْنِ عُمَرَ أَنَّهُ لَمَّا اشْتَازَ بِصَحْبِ الشَّبَابَ غَلَّقَ أُذَنَيْهِ. So he passed by a man who was playing an instrument, and he closed his ears. Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he plugged his ears. But he was with Nafi', وَلَمْ يَأْمُرْ نَافِعًا بِذَلِكَ يُحْتَمَلْ أَنَّ نَافِعًا لَمْ يُؤَثَرْ عِنْدَهُ فَلَا يَلْزِمُهُ غَرْقُ أُذَنَيْهِ. So what he was saying is, what that indicates is that Nafi' was not affected negatively by these things. And so he didn't have to close his ears. Now he says, and this is Imam al-Wazani, who wrote, I think, one of the finest legal arguments that I've ever heard for the permissibility of music. He was a great scholar from Morocco. And the Moroccans tended to follow the Andalusian school because the Andalusians tended to be more lenient about this. And it's important for those of us who are in the West, in societies where music is profoundly central to the cultural heritage. Even though there's a lot of negative music, nonetheless, music is profoundly central to the cultural heritage. And so we have to be careful about making this an issue whereby people actually are alienated from Islam. So it's very important to have a nuanced understanding of this, because in certain countries in the Muslim world, it's not a problem. But if you take certain types of Islam as the way you introduce people to Islam, that could have a very negative effect. And that's why triaging is very important. You have to let people see what Islam is before you start giving them all the details, many of which are not agreed upon. And this is part of the problem. We've got so many people that think this is Islam and there's no other Islam. It's my Islam or no Islam. And so what he says here, Imam Rawzani, فَلَا يَحِلُّ سَمَعُهَا اخْتِيارًا يعني حيث كانت تؤثر فيه بأن توقعه في محرم بدليل آخر كلامه حيث قال إن نافعا لم يؤثر فيه فلا يلزمه غلق أذنيه فهو يفيد أن عدم الحلية خاص بمن يؤثر فيه فتأمله. So what he's saying is, if you really look at the subtlety of this argument, he's saying that if it affects you negatively, right, then that's really what they're arguing, that you shouldn't be listening to this. And Nafi' was not affected by it, so he did not tell him to close his ears. So had it been haram to hear it, he would have told him to close the ears. Do you see? And so he says, this shows you that the prohibition is specific about the effect that it has on you. That's where the prohibition lies. And then he says, the great Shaykh Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi, he was a famous Shaykh, and he tended to incline towards the permissibility of sama'. So this is very different because Imam al-Ghazali argues for this, and Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi and others. في رسالتي بعد كلامه كذلك جميع الآلات المطربة. He says all of the musical instruments are like that. إذا استعملت باللهو واللعب كانت حراما وإذا خرجت عن اللهو عند أحد زالت الحرمة. So he's saying all of these instruments, if they are used just to completely divert people from what they should be doing or something like that, then of course they fall into that category of prohibition. But it depends on what they're being used for. So, and then he says, ومعلوم أن هذه الآلات المطربة بجميع أنواعها ليست حرمتها من حيث ذاتها وصورها المخصوصة ولا من حيث ما يصدر عنها من الأصوات المطربة وإلا لكان كل صوت مطربا حراما أو كل صوت مطربا. There's a mistake in there. حراما وهو باطل لأن أصوات الطيور والشحارير المطربة ليست حراما أو المطربة لأن أصوات الطيور والشحارير المطربة ليست حراما إجماعا بل حرمتها لاقتران اللهو بها ولكونها ملاهي. So he says, it's well known that all of these instruments, all these different types, their prohibition is not from the essence of these things or their forms, whatever specific form they take, but it has to be what they're used for. Because if you argued that, then you would have to say all of the musical sounds that you hear are prohibited, like the sounds of birds. And this is also Imam al-Ghazali's argument. He said you'd have to, when the birds start chirping, music, because they have maqams. You can actually, if a musician could take a bird song and put it into musical notation, because they're actually singing musical notes. And so he's saying if that's the case, then you'd have to say that all of that is haram. And he said that nobody says that. And then Abdul Ghani al-Nablusi also mentions that Ibn Hajar radiallahu anhu, when he was talking about the prohibition of instruments in a letter he wrote about that, he starts talking about sama' and the mazamir wasair al-malahi. And he said, وَلَسْنَا نُحَرِّمُ مُطَّقَ السَّمَاعِ وَلَا نَعْتَقِدُ أَنَّ كُلَّ مَا يُفْعَلُ مِنْ ذَلِكَ فَسَفْسَافٌ وَضَيَاعٌ بَلْ مُنْهُمُ الْعَارِفُونَ وَهُمْ حِزْبُ اللَّهِ أَلَا إِنَّ حِزْبَ اللَّهِ هُمُ الْغَالِبُونَ. So even Ibn Hajar is saying, we don't think that all of sama' is negative. No, some of it is not a waste of time. So it's important to see that. And I think another thing, and one of the things that the ulama mention is a lot of this, like I said, is sadd al-dharaya. But part of the problem with the sadd al-dharaya is that when you say something's haram to cut off the pretext of it, the danger of that is to fall under the category of وَلَا تَقُولُوا تَصِفُوا أَلْسِنَتُكُمُ الْكَذِبَ هَذَا حَلَالٌ وَهَذَا حَرَامٌ لِتَفْتَرُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَفْتَرُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ لَهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. You know, that the don't say with your tongues in a lying state, this is halal and this is haram, right? Only Allah can make halal and only Allah can make haram through His Prophet ﷺ. So if something is not clearly haram in the Quran or in the Hadith, then you have to be very careful. And the later ulama took that road of declaring things halal and haram that the early community did not. And they